To kick off the new season, we feature a special guest, Dr. Robert Dietz, Chief Economist at the National Association of Homebuilders. Dr. Dietz provides a data-driven review of 2025 and an outlook for 2026. From the impact of interest rates and tariffs to shifting demographics, this episode explores the forces shaping the American dream.
How big of a deal are the tariffs?
In theory, they could have been quite large, but through the advocacy efforts of groups like NAHB, making the case for housing affordability, the tariffs as actually implemented are fairly small. 18% of single-family home building is townhouses. A decade ago, it was only 9%. So that market share has doubled. Remodeling right now is 45% of residential construction spending. So that's new single family, new multifamily, and then remodeling and rehab. 45%. Over the next decade, it's going to be more than 50%. So remodeling is going to gain a growing market share.
I'd like to welcome everybody to the Construction Lending Podcast. I'm your host, Sean Ferris, and we have a fantastic guest for you today. You know, we're wrapping up 2025, and it's always good to do kind of like a year in review and kind of let's look into the future a little bit. But our guest today is Dr. Robert Dietz, and he is the Chief Economist at the NAHB, National Association for Home Builders. Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Glad to talk about housing.
Yeah, no, this is exciting. I think you're the first economist that we've ever had on the podcast. So this is going to be a good one. I'm excited.
Yep.
Well, as we jump in, being an economist for the NAHB, how did you get there? Like, did you wake up one day and say, hey, housing sounds interesting, or did you have a background in housing? It's kind of two worlds, mixing together.
Yeah, I got really lucky. In fact, when I talk to kind of students who are studying economics, they sort of say, how did you follow your career path? And I said, be lucky and be around motivated, really good people. So I showed up as an undergrad at George Washington University in DC. My very first econ class, the professor was great. And it turned out he was the housing economist. And he sort of recruited me as an economics major and said, you're going to be a housing guy. I finished my undergrad, got the PhD. He kind of recommended a good advisor to work with. So I ended up at the Ohio State University for a number of years, got a PhD, focused on housing. And then I ended up working for my two predecessors at NAHB, who were both the chief economists, and all four of those individuals knew each other. And so I kind of just a straight shot to this particular job, which is a great job. You get to look at the American dream and small business and the economy. And so it's great to work with, and I've got a great team as well.
No, that's awesome. I mean, you pretty much grew up or grew through, got your whole education in it. And it's not like you were adjacent or got shifted over. Like you've lived it.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, every crisis that's come along the way. I mean, I joined NAHB November 2005, which was the peak of the building boom. And then my early years were all about the homebuyer tax credit and the net operating loss carryback and the policies that helped the industry get through to the period of underbuilding that we experienced in the 10 years prior to COVID.
Tell me, what is the role of the chief economist at the NAHB? Like, what do you focus on? What does your kind of day or month look like over there?
Yeah, I mean, so we've got three groups within the department, a team of about 12 economists, and those groups kind of reflect the tasks. We try to forecast the economic conditions, the housing market. We do a lot of survey analysis, kind of doing surveys of remodelers, apartment builders, land developers, single-family home builders, to get a sense of where the industry is and the whole industry, because NAHB's got about 140,000 members, builders big and small, all over the country. And then the third area is policy research. So we help and advise our lobbyists who fight for NAHB's members to advocate for housing and small business issues and regulatory issues. So it's a great job because you're both kind of doing forward-looking analysis, a lot of backward-looking analysis to kind of learn, and then trying to really in real time affect the rules that can benefit home builders, benefit home buyers, and renters.
No, that's really interesting that you brought up surveys in that. And When I think about, all the measurements and stuff that we have to do at Landgrilla, performance wise and KPIs and, and growth and all of that, it's such a blend of, hey, getting out there and talking to the customer and gathering kind of this loose, fuzzy feedback, and then actually looking at numbers and comparing them. you know, when I've tried to study the housing market and look at the housing market, I get lost in the information. And I always get, like, when are they talking about multifamily or single family? Are they really talking about my version of multifamily or my version of single family? Or, is this market, how are they looking at this? I mean, what is your approach to kind of combing through a lot of that data? Do you just have so much experience in it now that that you're really comfortable with it, or are you constantly evaluating it? How do you think about gathering the information?
I think we're sort of constantly uncomfortable because the
Mhm.
definitions change, but we do benefit from the fact that a lot of our surveys, like the NAHB Housing Market Index, the monthly single family builder sentiment index, goes back to 1986.
Wow.
So, it is a challenge because our industry, unlike a lot of industries in the economy, has really small firms, home builders that only build 5 homes a year. And then we've got, the big national builders that build thousands of homes a year and have multiple geographic footprints. So getting the definitions right is absolutely part of it. But then you've also got, the kind of the evolution of the industry. Single family built for rent is a great example of that. If you go back 20 years ago, single family built for rent was mostly senior housing. It was only about 3% of single family housing starts. Today, it's more than 10% of how single family starts. So it's tripled in size. And it's got big builders, master plan communities, plus the old versions of it. So the industry is constantly evolving as the demand side, the supply side, the industry structure changes. And we're trying, like everybody else, to kind of utilize those new analytical tools. We do a lot of surveys. We used to read through all the comments that we would get, and now we're utilizing AI tools to summarize some of that, look for trends, things that we're missing. So it's a great environment. But I think the most important thing that my team and myself do is travel. Once a week, I go out and I visit a market, visit builders. This week, I'm going to San Antonio. Next week, it's New Orleans, and stand up in front of builders and remodelers and bankers and realtors, say what we think, and then engage with them in Q&A to hear what we potentially have wrong or we need to go and analyze. So that kind of real-time feedback in person is really key to working at a trade association.
Well, that's really interesting. You mentioned, some AI and technology, and I've always wondered how the broader scheme of like data management now with AI, really puts everything on steroids. How do you think, building cycles, boom bust, expansion, contraction is now affected by having much better data? If we go back into the 80s, a builder can kind of overbuild pretty easily without understanding the influences on what's going to happen in the future. But now that we have not just AI, but just better quality data, more information, are they better prepared for kind of boom bust environments? You know, are they thinking about it differently? How has that impacted,
Yeah,
home building?
the impact of technology, I think, has reduced some of the downtimes, reduced some of the lag, the dead weight loss when it comes to efficiency. But I'll give you maybe a little bit of a contrarian answer. What I think those improvements in technology have done is heightened the constraints from other factors in the industry that limit the ability to supply. So, if you make your material arrival times more efficient because you can track these things and predict them and have better predictors of the pricing, then the additional binding constraints of whether you have enough labor or what's the lot supply look in your market, or the big one for small builders, the availability of construction financing loans and the cost. So what it does is it reduces some of the inefficiencies in some parts of the market and then makes the headaches that remain seem that much more relatively important.
That's interesting. Well, as we kind of look back in 2025, why don't you give us your opinion of how did we do? Did we beat expectations? Did we not beat expectations? Was it good? Was it bad? How are you looking at the year in review?
Yeah, I think the single word I've been using when we think about 2025, and keep in mind, we haven't gotten the full data for
Yeah.
2025. So this is partly the data we have plus our expectations of what the final data will look like. But the single word is probably disappointing.
Okay.
If you go back a year and a half ago, particularly right before or during the election, the expectation is we were going to see some regulatory relief. We were going to see an extension of the 2017 tax cuts, which would provide momentum for businesses and consumers. And the result was, and we had warned about some of this. Economists are not big fans of tariffs, for example, but tariff policy, immigration policy, uncertainty itself really resulted in a lot of buyers remaining on the sidelines and a lot of builders having to pull back. And those builders who in 2014 were expecting trend expansion like we saw in 2024, particularly in the spec home building market, likely found that they were out ahead of where the actual realized demand in the market was. So we entered the year expecting 2025 single family housing starts to be flat, maybe a slight gain. And it's looking like, based on the data that we have thus far, that single family home building was down about 7% in 2025. Now, the expectation is as we get more certainty about policy, I think we're going to see a renewed interest in trying to find regulatory relief to address the housing crisis. That should lead for a slight gain in 2026, but the wild cards remain, and those wild cards really did show up in 2025.
How much did interest rates impact 2025? Coming from the construction lending world, rate is a big impact, right? It's high rates, not a lot of business. Low rates, a lot of business. But we knew there were going to be rate cuts. We saw some rate cuts. The needle started to move. Was that a positive thing? Was it not enough? How much did that play into 2025?
It was a negative thing in the sense that we had to wait for it. The Fed cutting by 100 basis points around the election at the end of 2024 was part of the reason that we all kind of felt, some hope, some optimism that they would continue to cut. And then whether it was because of tariffs, whether it was political, the Fed basically went on pause from January to September, and so that
got nervous,
holding,
right?
they didn't know exactly how, for example, the tariffs were going to feed through. And I think the dominant view now is that tariffs reflect a one-time price adjustment, not contribute to persistent inflation growth. And I think the Fed has come around to that. Certainly, some of the governors have, and that's the reason they have begun to ease again. But yeah, the interest rates, I think, really were the sort of the dominating factor when we think about some of the disappointment in 25. From the demand side, mortgage rates remaining, mostly above 6.2% for the year. There were a few months in the middle of the year where rates seemed like they were going higher again. And then, as you noted, on the supply side, when we think about construction and development, A, and C lending rates, those rates really are tied to what the Fed does in the prime rate. And so the fact that the Fed was on pause meant those interest rates were higher at the start of the year. So for smaller builders, there was this kind of constrained lending environment. For the overall industry, including the national builders, you had a lot of home buyers that remained on the sidelines of buyer traffic, disappointed, and then just the general impact of uncertainty on consumer confidence held back the market. So I think we're in a better position now. We will likely see one or two additional rate cuts from the Fed at the start of 2026. Most economists think that the inflation data will be noisy, but the general trend will be lower, provided we don't get a big ramp up in the tariffs that, as not announced, but as actually implemented. They're about half the size of what we were all modeling back in April. And so that should put us in a good position for some policy easing. The risk for 2026 that's new is that the labor market is weakening. The unemployment rate's at 4.6. So we'll have to watch that in the entry-level space and rental demand.
Okay. How has tariffs, in a practical sense, impacted housing? And one of the really interesting things that, we looked at and talked a lot about last year was the impact of inflation in 2021, 2022. we were having a lot of conversations with clients where people had started building a home and the cost of lumber was shooting up. You remember all of that? Or,
Oh, yeah.
appliances, just the expenses were just ballooning in real
Yeah.
time. And lots of conversations, lots of real hands-on impact. When we think about tariffs, I haven't been on a call where it's even come up like, hey, we're having prices are going up. Is it the fact that we've kind of adjusted to the inflation issue happened before that? We've kind of accommodated for rising prices, or is it like, hey, it's not as big as impact as we think in the practical sense, or like how big of a deal are the tariffs?
In theory, they could have been quite large, but
Yeah.
through the advocacy efforts of groups like NAHB, making the case for housing affordability, the tariffs as actually implemented are fairly small. So the impacts have been pretty minor. What you've heard is exactly what we see in the surveys. Impacts of a few $1,000s at most. In fact, some in our surveys, 40% of home builders say they've seen no impact from tariffs on building material pricing. So I've been sort of characterizing them as measurable but minor. But let's take an example of that, softwood lumber. So you mentioned the lumber price spikes of 21 and 22. I think we all remember that lumber prices went from $350 per thousand board feet up to like $1,500 due to the ramp up of demand and historically low interest rates and constrained supply. Now, that episode, which we have seen nothing like that in the last few years, was a reflection of the fact that we don't produce a lot of lumber in the United States, and roughly a quarter of our supply comes from Canada. So the risk was with tariffs, what were the tariff rates, the duty rates on Canadian softwood lumber going to be for U.S. building supply purchasers? At the start of the year, the anti-dumping countervailing duty rate on Canadian softwood lumber was 15%, the start of 2025. It went up to 30% in the summer. And then there was a real risk that on top of that 30%, we would get another 50% tariff through a combination of the Canadian tariff and then something called the Section 232 national security tariff. That would have created an effective tariff rate on Canadian lumber of 80%. That would have been a huge issue. But instead, what was actually announced was just a 10% Section 232 tariff. So the effective tariff rate now is certainly higher than it was at the start of 25, but it's 40% or so. And so the result is through decreased demand for softwood lumber, because the building industry did not grow last year, and a slightly lower than expected duty and tariff rate, we haven't seen a lot of movement in lumber prices. And that's an unambiguous good thing for the industry and home buyers and renters.
Would you say when we think about tariffs, like the big one people are concerned about is lumber? Like, is that like that's the scary one that sits on our shoulder, or are there other materials that sit out there that we should be, cognizant of?
At the start of the year, we kind of looked at it. Lumber is the one we always kind of focus on because it's the one that as a policy lever that the industry through advocacy can help. But appliances was a big deal. I mean, 85% of refrigerators are manufactured in Mexico. So the U.S. Mexican trade relationship is critical there. So if you think about the direct tariff effects, I would tend to think about lumber and appliances. It's more the indirect effect, I think, that economists like myself tend to get sort of nervous about. It's the impact on regional economies. Like what's the economic environment of Michigan and Ohio going to look like when we have a deteriorating trade relationship with Canada, and what impacts on auto parts manufacturing, that sort of thing. So it's more the macro side, and I think we are seeing some weakening on the labor market that is due to not tariffs per se, but just the kind of the wait and see environment. And so economists like certainty. We like low tax rates, really efficient regulatory policy. And I hope that's what we're building to in 2026.
Yeah, we all love predictability. Trust me, like that's the sweet spot. Now, it doesn't sound like 2025 was all doom and gloom. We just didn't meet expectations. Any highlights in 2025? Any surprises that were more on the positive side?
Yeah, I mean the custom building market actually did okay. We don't have the final data. We'll get third quarter data
Mhm.
at the end of this week, but I think what we will see is the custom building market, and let's define what that is.
Yeah.
It's about 20% of construction. It's builders building on an owner's lot. Owner built, contractor built, the builder working under a construction contract. There's no sale of real estate. The builder never owns the structure or the land. So they're working more as a contractor. That particular market segment, which tends to be larger homes, more expensive homes, older buyers, wealthier buyers, that market grew. Now, why is that? Well, the parts of the market where we saw weakness, markets like Texas and Florida and Denver, markets with a lot of first-time home buyers that are really sensitive to interest rates, and mortgage rates remained higher than we expected. So some of that demand pulled back. The custom building market with that older, wealthier buyer is much more correlated with the stock market than it is the interest rate cycle. So the stock market gains meant that those folks, those potential buyers, had more wealth to purchase those custom homes. So that market expanded. And another bright spot that we continue to see is the townhouse market. Townhouse construction is now 18% of single family. And just kind of a technical footnote on that. Yeah. Townhouses, we classify along with the Census Bureau and most academics as single family. They've got a front door. They don't typically share common space. Some classify townhouses based on multifamily definitions. This is one of those areas where it depends on the analyst you're talking to.
When you see a townhouse, what do you see? What are the characteristics of a townhouse versus a single family, the typical American dream home? Like, what are the characteristics that you see different?
For primary definitions, they share a wall,
Yep.
right? And so they're not subject to the kind of the setback requirements. They don't have to have the kind of the lots, a more medium density. They typically are going to have a front door. The way the definition works is they've got to have their individual utility lines. So that would just make them different than like a duplex or a quadplex. But yeah, that kind of typical townhouse is basically a single family home that shares a wall, and it doesn't necessarily have to be 2 or 3 or 4 stories. And I mentioned 4 stories because that's one of the areas where we see a lot of growth. It's this kind of really tall.
Wow.
Typical townhouse. In fact, I keep telling the Census Bureau they measure townhouses with 3 stories or more. They need to add a new category because of the expansion of that area. But there's also 1-story townhouses. In fact, we see that a lot in single family built for rent. It's a single story structure, but it shares walls. And it's a way to build that kind of light touch density.
Interesting that they're not capitalizing on the going vertical over horizontal.
Yeah, the height of the building is going to be correlated with the value of the land. So if you're building kind of a what we'd like to call horizontal multifamily, that kind of single family built for rent market, but the land is more accessible, well, you can go low as opposed to go vertical.
And why is this growing?
Yeah, townhouse construction in areas where the zoning permits it, and the greatest, sort of constraint against additional townhouse construction is typically setback requirements or minimum lot sizes. But what we see in the consumer survey research is there's a lot of frustrated younger home buyers that want to get on that rung of home ownership in terms of their ladder of housing. And they're willing to sacrifice the lot or the yard for that front door and the owned structure. So we see a lot of expansion of that. And then there's some other kind of waves that are helping it. One example is conversion of commercial real estate. So think about the dying shopping mall. If you can get that footprint, a large parking lot and the kind of buildings in the middle, that's great to build an urban village. Build some retail in the middle, restaurants, bars, and then on the outside you've got townhouses. And so that trend is also helping. So 18% of single family home building is townhouses. A decade ago, it was only 9%. So that market share has doubled. That's an amazing move. I think the trend's going to continue. And if you look at the demographics of where the new buyers for that, it's a lot of millennials. And we'll see more demand.
Where do you think that's the most popular? Is that something that we see just all over the board in every state? Is it certain regions? Like any insights there?
Yeah, I mean, you think about it, it's kind of expensive, high cost of living areas. So kind of the Washington,
Mhm.
D.C.'s, Boston, New York area, some parts of California. But it's been kind of amazing to watch it even spread into areas where that wasn't a traditional form of housing, like the Midwest. So, like, take a market like Columbus or Indianapolis, Charlotte, North Carolina. I've heard some of the townhouses are sitting a little bit longer in Charlotte, but it's a way when we face a housing deficit to get more housing units on a given amount of dirt. And that's really the goal here. So not every buyer wants a townhouse, of course, but I just see this as one of those areas where we can get some additional growth. Now, I think that market share can go as high as 25% just based on the demographics. But as I said, the kind of the secret sauce to allow for that supply to happen, to allow a market to take advantage of that particular submarket is zoning. And if zoning does not permit that because the setback requirement is such that you got to have at least 30 feet separating houses, which by definition rules out townhouse construction, you can't do it. But I've been surprised to the degree to which, as I travel, the number of markets where townhouse construction, well, not a majority, is certainly a high growth segment.
Do you see that as a regulatory barrier, or do you see more regulation kind of being more flexible to that, like because they can get higher density, or is that like a trend that's kind of encouraging it, or is it something else?
It is a trend. I mean, one of the things that has been kind of interesting, 20, 15 years ago, as I traveled around and kind of warned that we were facing a housing deficit because of the current level of underbuilding. And I would talk to policymakers. So these are mayors and city council people, zoning, governors. And I would say, we need more housing supply. And about half of them would say, yes, I understand. The other half would be like, no. They talk about traffic or the kind of typical NIMBY excuses. What has changed since COVID is, as I go around and do the same kind of talks, almost everyone now recognizes supply side problem. We need to add more housing supply, townhouses being part of that. What the remaining sort of leg to kind of complete the objective, though, is to turn the talk into the walk. They need to actually enact pro-supply regulatory policies, and zoning is one of those. There's a lot of issues around building codes and parking requirements for multifamily buildings, but I think the conversation has really changed. And if you need any proof of that, the last presidential election, I think, featured more housing debates. I think about the vice presidential debate. Governor Walz and Vice President Vance talked about housing a lot. And according to some of the folks I work with, they said it was the most housing policy discussion they'd seen since the Johnson administration in the 60s. So that reflects the degree to which that cost of living discussion has taken hold. People know it's about housing, and ultimately the only solution, rent control is not going to work. Various kinds of demand side subsidies aren't going to work. It's just about building more housing stock for the population that we have.
Wow. I mean, you mentioned that townhouse, we're seeing growth, and that was a positive thing for 2025. Any other areas that we saw, kind of positive growth? Is it, I think of manufactured housing, or factory built housing, I should probably say, multifamily. How did those perform, when we look back?
Yeah, the what we call off-site construction, which consists of three different segments. Off-site construction includes manufactured housing, which typically we would have referred to as mobile homes. It includes modular construction, which is 3D construction, most of the home built in a factory, and then panelized construction, where more like 2D construction. You're building the frames, the panels in the factory, and then assembling them. Manufactured housing, there's a lot of discussion about that. It typically is sitting on land, so the tenant has to rent that land. It's about 100,000 units a year. There's some upside potential. Modular and panelized construction, which is it's off-site, but it looks like a traditional single-family home. Depending on how you measure it, it's 3 to 7% of single-family home building. Here's the striking thing. Let's say it's 3% based on the census data. In the late 90s, it was 7 to 8%. So the conversation for it has gone
Whoa.
up, but the actual market share has gone down.
Cut in half.
Now, why is that? Well, there's been, it's been a challenge for builders to adapt to it. I think it's got a lot of potential. I think it is one of the areas where we could get some productivity growth in terms of home building. But there's also some geographic mismatches. A lot of that kind of construction was in places that had factory legacies, like Pennsylvania. Well, Pennsylvania is not one of the bigger home building markets, right? Texas, Florida, parts of the South. So it's going to take some time for the kind of the manufacturing capacity to move to where the building's taking place. It's going to take some time for builders kind of work out, how and what kind of projects to utilize. But I think the market share for that should likely climb to about 10%, and we will see some growth. So not exactly a bright spot. We'll call that a potential for growth down the road. And it's one of the areas where we can offset the labor shortage that the home building industry has by essentially increasing output per worker through offsite construction.
I'll take it, man. 3 to 10% would be amazing for factory build housing. That would be fantastic. And one we didn't touch on: multifamily apartment buildings.
So there's kind of a debate right now as we talk in sort of mid January 2026 of what the 2025 data looks like. Let me give you one view, and then I will give you my view. One view is multifamily construction was down a lot in 2025, and that's typically, you hear that from some of the private data providers in large metropolitan areas working with the largest apartment builders. I think that's correct, but it's not the full picture. If you look at the full country of multifamily, and here definitions matter. So we're defining multifamily as duplexes on up to a high rise. So it's everything that's essentially larger than a townhouse.
Small, medium, and large.
That's right.
We've got it all. Big bucket.
So when we look at the census data, and again, we've only got data through about August, but when we look at the data, what we see is, according to the first version, declines in multifamily construction in the largest markets. But then we see gains in exurban markets, rural areas, not a big share, but rural areas, small towns, secondary and tertiary cities. It's the lower density markets that actually saw gains. And those markets typically don't feature the largest apartment builders. So what we think when we get the final data for 2025 is that multifamily construction will likely have eked out a small gain despite some of the negativity. And really the expectation for multifamily construction is plus or minus, it's going to be right around 400,000 units a year for the coming years. I don't see a lot of change. Now we'll see some geography, some composition mix. We're all waiting for that. You mentioned it earlier, the missing middle, that kind of 2 to 4 unit multifamily. There's some hints in the data that has begun to increase. It's not increasing anywhere near as fast as townhouse construction, but I'm kind of bullish on the idea of more duplexes and quadplexes as we see investors, particularly in the market, and zoning reform. That would help. A persistent area of weakness in terms of multifamily is the built for sale market. The condo market, particularly if you think about markets like Florida in terms of resale condos, declines in demand, declines in pricing. Some of that is about reinvestment and HOA fees. But built for sale multifamily is only 5% of multifamily construction. Historically, it was 20%. So that also gets to that kind of question of the housing deficit and the missing entry level construction. Yeah. Part of the entry level was condo multifamily. Well, after the Great Recession, the regulatory rules, the litigation rules changed. And it just doesn't make economic sense in most cases to build built for sale multifamily. So that market has really kind of transformed 95% into built for rent. And we think that change will persist.
Wow. When I think about all this, and you even mentioned the vice president debate and so much talk about housing, how big of a hole are we in? Are we in a housing deficit? Are we short on a lot of housing? Is that why it's important right now? What's your take on, are we short? Are we close? Are we see a path forward, or are kids going to inherit a huge mess of not being able to afford a home?
Yeah, this is the number one question I get on the road is there a housing deficit? How big is it? There's a variety of estimates out there. I think the one that's the most common you'll see in the media is the country's about 4 million residences short. That's single family and multifamily combined. What we're looking at is the size of the population, the number of households, and the size of the housing stock. Our team for years has thought that 4 million number was too big. Our estimate is about 1 million to 1.5 million structural deficit. And we get that by basically looking at vacancy rates, compare it to historic norms, and say, how much housing stock would you have to add overnight to get the vacancy rates to go back to normal? And that's about 1 million, 1.5 million or so. Now, right now, the month supply in terms of the cyclical inventory is elevated. And that's because you got a lot of buyers that are hesitating, a lot of renters that live with their parents. They've doubled and tripled up with roommates. But the structural deficit, I think, is a guide to how single family home building is going to play out over the next decade, which is ultimately we're going to get up to about 1.1 million. We'll probably reduce that housing deficit number by several 100,000 units a year. I think by 2032 or so, the structural deficit for the most part will have been diminished. And then we get into a different environment in the 2030s as household formations decline. So the next cycle is really about reducing that structural deficit, seeing housing affordability conditions normalize. And again, the way that we do that is just building more. So we're looking for single family housing starts, like I said, 1 million, 1.1 million in the years ahead.
That's really interesting. And as we kind of transition this conversation and thinking about the future, you mentioned 2030 decline in household formation. And I'm really curious about that. What is, I'll start with a simple question. What does that even mean?
Yeah. Yeah, if you look at a demographic profile of the United States right now, what you'll see is there's kind of one big group of boomers, kind of senior population. Then you've got where I am. I'm right around age 50. I'm in Gen X. Gen X is kind of this valley. There's fewer Gen Xers. And then you've got another big grouping, the millennials, who are kind of in their 30s or early 40s. They're going to drive single family housing demand over the next decade. But then Gen Z, which is kind of in their 20s, smaller generation, and then Gen Alpha, which is today's 10-year-olds and 5-year-olds. They're the smallest generation in the United States in more than a century. So what's going to happen is the millennials move through the system through their kind of prime buying years. When we get to the mid-2030s, the amount of new households being formed from Gen Z and Gen Alpha is going to go down. And in fact, there are good estimates from academics at Harvard and other analysts that suggest household formation, which is basically somebody moving out from their parents to become an independent renter or homeowner. Household formations will fall by about 25%. So the result is the demand for new construction by the time we get to the mid-2030s is likely to go down 20 to 25%, as long as second home housing demand remains relatively stable. So by the time we get in the mid-2030s, the building industry is going to undergo an evolution. Doesn't mean the end of single-family building, but it does mean a shift in the composition. We're going to see more tear-down construction as a total of the share. We're going to see more remodeling activity. In fact, remodeling right now is 45% of residential construction spending. So that's new single family, new multifamily, and then remodeling and rehab. 45%. Over the next decade, it's going to be more than 50%. So remodeling is going to gain a growing market share, and that's because of an aging housing stock and those declines in household formations. And the big driver behind this, by the way, is this is why I love doing housing economics. We get to talk about demographics. The declining fertility rate. The fertility rate in the United States is 1.6 births per woman. Well, what's it got to be to hold the population constant? 2.05, right?
Oh,
Noah's Ark arithmetic. Yeah, it's got to be a little bit above 2, right? And so at 1.6, basically the population absent immigration is declining.
Yeah.
And so this, again, we'll go back to the vice president. He has talked about this a lot. What do we do to start having, households have kids again? Because that has big impacts on the labor market and productivity growth and AI and all these other kind of issues. And you see it, by the way, it's not just the U.S. Like the fertility rate in South Korea is like 1.2. I mean, it's the lowest in the world. Russia has seen big declines in the fertility rate. China, for the last 2 years, the Chinese population's gone down for the last 2 years. It's sort of ironic when you think about the last few decades. We talked about overpopulation as a global issue. The global issue for the 21st century is really declining population. Well, it has distinct impacts for the housing industry, what we build, the housing demand needs. And I would argue that the fertility rate itself is a function of the fact that we have that housing deficit that we were just talking about. We underbuilt entry-level housing from 2012 up through COVID, made it harder for people to form those independent households. They got married later in life, and they're having fewer kids as a result. So to policymakers and think tankers and futurists who sort of say, we need to fix the fertility rate, I say, if you want to do that, build more housing. That's a key ingredient to solving that particular social problem.
Well, it sounds like, and this makes a little bit more sense. I was kind of scratching my head, and I thought it was really interesting when I saw Donald Trump talking about, he kind of took a pause. Usually he just kind of jumps all over the answer, and he's responding faster than they can ask the question.
Right.
But he started making this comment like housing. We're really trying to balance people have accumulated a lot of this equity in their houses, and we want them to keep that. And I was like,
Yeah.
wow. He didn't just immediately jump on that, like, build, baby, build,
Right.
which is what I was expecting. And I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. And now hearing you say that, it's like, if we could just hold off 4 more years at the rate that we're going, and we're automatically going to meet the pinnacle of where we need to be as far as supply balance.
Well, it from an aggregate perspective, and I
Yeah.
would say maybe not 4 years, but maybe something closer to like 9 years. That's a
Okay.
long time, and it will have a lot of negative consequences if you're basically saying, well, we'll just have a housing deficit for the greater part of a decade, and then we'll deal with the fallout. I would say let's build to kind of house those people. But yeah, your comments about the back and forth, lots of home equity in homes. Well, home prices have gone up on average 60% since COVID. It's great if you're a homeowner, right?
Yeah.
If you're 23 and you saw the price to income ratio go from the historic norm of 3 to 1 to 5 to 1, not only are you worried about a 6% mortgage interest rate, but you're worried about the down payment necessary with that 5 to 1 price to income ratio. So it has kind of real distinct impacts, and depending on your age, your wealth. One of the things my PhD advisor used to say is, when thinking about whether you were going to be successful in life, choose your parents well. People that have great parents who have access to the bank of mom and dad can attain home ownership. Is that fair? Does that create social problems? It does. And I would argue the solutions really are on the supply side, but that's part of the discussion. There's no free lunch here. There's no risk-averse path, that straight shot. There are going to be some costs. And one of the things about building more is that home price growth has got to slow down. In a healthy market, home price growth should equal income growth. That's not what's happened the last 4 to 5 years.
How do we solve that?
Well, I think a lot of it's going to be regulatory reform. It's about communities getting serious to building. And so that not only means things like zoning reform to build with more density. It doesn't have to be townhouses. It can be small lot, single family. It can be more multifamily. It can mean expansion of single family built for rent. But it also means all those other ticky-tack costs that build up during the land development, the construction phase, the lending phase, the appraisal phase. And so things like permit fees, impact fees. I mean, there are markets in California that the regulatory costs before you put a shovel in the ground can be $200,000 per home. Finding ways to reduce those, or at least being smart about the public finance of them. Rather than charging permit and impact fees, finance those with bonds and then use property taxes over 20 to 30 years to pay off those fees rather than doing them up front. A variety of different regulatory ways that we can increase construction.
Yeah, but all that's out of design. I'm in California. I'm in one of those towns. They intentionally do this. It's engineered to create a high barrier. They don't want more people building homes. They made it. They'll come out and say that. They have complete processes and bureaucracy and departments that are designed to prevent you.
Well, there
And
there are no home runs, but that's all about then, sort of alliance building. The building industry has got to work with the YIMBY movement, the Yes in My Backyard movement. We got to kind of convince a number of the NIMBYs and kind of really talk about young households and their attempts to become homeowners. And I like to say we got to just outright fight the group I call the bananas, which are the
Mhm.
build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything.
I
They're a
love it.
lost cause.
It we had a it's like a housing forum that was put on by our local home builders association, and they invited groups from, I think it was Santa Barbara County, San Luis Obispo County, the city of Santa Maria, which is kind of technically in Santa Barbara County, but
Right.
really is geographically kind of cut off. And there's home builders, there's all sorts of stakeholders, and just watching the different groups representing the building departments from the different cities or counties
Right.
up there talk about it was the funniest thing I've ever seen, because I mean they're just blatantly open about, well, we're not here to serve you, we're here to make
Yeah.
it difficult for you. You shouldn't be able to get a permit over the counter. It needs to take you 18 months to 2 years and cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars to do that. We don't want to help you.
That's right. Yeah, you're
And those,
exactly right. It's by design. And that's why California has 18 of the least 20 affordable markets, the regulatory environment.
how do we get how do we solve for that? Because I'm of the back regulation. We do a lot of these podcasts, and everybody gets to talk about what's getting in the way of building more housing. And when we get down to it, like, hey, if you can change one thing, it's always some regulation. And
Yeah,
how do we transform? Does it take a federal act, an executive order to say no more building departments, no more planning departments, built, like how drastic do we have to take this to get some sort of meaningful impact coming from it?
I tend to be conservative by nature, but I think some radical moves led by the federal government, led by people that think that adding housing stock is the way to do it. So one idea is to take community development financing that comes from groups like HUD and the Transportation Department and link that kind of financing to showing measurable improvements in building permits or building codes or whatever the regulatory issue. And I think there is a listening audience in Washington right now for that kind of maybe an action that in prior Republican administrations would have said, no, that's a violation of federalism principles. Let state and locals do what they want. Right now, this is an administration of action, and so I think they're more likely to engage on that. But it's a there are no, as I said before, there are no home runs. I like to say there's no single, simple, scalable solution. It's really about the industry speaking with a unified voice about the benefits of additional rental housing, for sale housing, and working with community groups to make improvements. And we're not going to win in every jurisdiction. And the jurisdictions that do win are going to see outsized business investment growth, better housing affordability conditions. And those will be the places where people, those young households, will move and have kids and establish roots and invest. And that's really what we need.
Well, that's sorry I get so passionate about it. As soon as you start mentioning building permits, it's like, oh man, that's like a dagger in my heart.
Yeah.
Um, as we look at 2026, we're midway through January. How is this going to measure to 2025?
Yeah, I think the expectation is that single family housing starts in 2026 are going to show a slight improvement. But I think this is very much a curb your enthusiasm type moment. The thing there are certain things that are lining up that will help consumers. The Fed easing is going to put some downward pressure on mortgage interest rates. We all know, of course, the Fed
Mhm.
doesn't control mortgage interest rates, but we'll see short-term rates move lower. The yield curve should flatten out a little bit. And then one thing that I'm not sure everyone's accounting for in their models, I think income tax refunds are going to be a little bit bigger this year. And the reason why is in terms of the timing of the extension of the 2017 tax policies, income growth, some reduction in bracket creep. So the result is that after tax incomes in 2026 are likely to be a little bit bigger than most households are already expecting. So that means some additional savings. It means some additional consumer spending. It could help the remodeling market. So there is some upside potential. What I would ask from policymakers is, this might be too much to ask in the current environment, but certainty, some predictability, that to tone down the improv just a little bit so the businesses can make those investment decisions. And so single family, I say a slight gain, multifamily construction roughly flat, depends on the data revisions that we talked about. And then we see continued growth, in fact, outperforming the rest of the industry for the remodeling market, because homeowners have $36 trillion in home equity. And if HELOC rates go down, we're going to see them tap those, and we'll see some reinvestment in the existing stock.
Yeah, we didn't get to talk a lot about remodeling, but you said it makes up 40% of the construction market?
Well, 45% of residential construction activity right now is remodeling, and I think over the next decade, it's going to go above 50%. That's right.
Wow, that's phenomenal. What drives those numbers? What do you think? Is availability to equity? Is it cash on hand? Is it?
Yeah, the big one is home equity. That's
Mhm.
that's the big one. But on the sort of the need side, aging housing stock, the age of a typical owner-occupied home in the United States right now is about 41 years old.
Yeah.
15 years ago, it was closer to 31. That's a dramatic aging. It's due to the fact that we didn't have a lot of new construction over the last decade. Aging population is also driving it. So one of the areas where we see a lot of remodeling growth as a delta, as a kind of a new activity, is aging in place investment in homes. So these are older homeowners. Not everyone is going to move to Phoenix or the villages. They're going to stay in their existing home. In fact, one of the consequences of COVID is a decline in the number of people going to nursing facilities. So there's this sort of need to invest in existing homes. So that's driving it. And then the other one is, in terms of drivers, is a little counterintuitive. Typically, we think that when there's a lot of existing home sales activity, we get remodeling growth. And in fact, we find about half of remodeling activity is connected to when a homeowner puts the home up for sale, or when the new buyer purchases the home and makes certain structural changes. Of course, we all know that mobility, that resale activity has really fallen off because of a number of factors, but most importantly, the mortgage rate lock-in effect that has kept
Yeah.
buyers in place. Well, that mortgage rate lock-in effect under the old models would have hurt remodeling. It's actually helping remodeling right now, because
Hmm.
there's a lot of homeowners, if they can't purchase a new home, they can restructure their existing home into a new home, right?
Yeah.
Make those changes and additions as the life happens moments occur of empty nesting, or you have kids, or you multi-generational household form. So there's a lot of kind of good tailwinds for the remodeling industry right now, and home equity is available there to power it. So we're real bullish on the remodeling market over the next decade.
Oh, this is exciting. This has been just such a great conversation. I think we can go on for hours talking about this. I'm going to go ahead and just start
Yeah, do
firing
it.
off some questions for you. Uh, Recent product or innovation that you've come to know that you just can't live without.
This is one's going to sound trite, because I think a lot of people will have it in common, but AI bots that automate the news for me. I spend a huge amount of my day just trying to read what other people are writing, and getting those summaries done automatically has saved me a huge amount of time.
Oh, wow, that's awesome. Uh, Recent book that you absolutely love.
So I'm finishing 1177, the end of the Bronze Age. When people think about the Dark Ages, they tend to think about the end of the Roman Empire. This is before that. This is the end of the Bronze Age. I'm a big fan of that period of history. It's sort of like the era of the Trojan War and things like that. It's totally different than what I do day to day. I love ancient history.
I wrote that one down. I'm going to check it out. Sounds interesting.
Eric Klein, great author.
Eric Klein. All right. Uh, would you ever build your own home if you haven't done it already?
So I live in an 80-year-old townhouse near the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. I have to be near the Reagan National Airport. If I had the land and the ability to do it, I would love to buy a newly built home. I tour them all the time, and one of the things I don't tell people often is I feel a little jealous. But I have been a big sponsor of the remodeling industry because we've invested a lot in this home. But I've got to be close to downtown D.C. And Reagan National Airport, and there's not a lot of room for new construction.
All right. If you could snap your finger and change one regulation out there, which one would it be and why?
I think one that would have a big impact is the ability to subdivide lots by right. So if you could take inner suburb lots, big lots that have a small home built in the 40s and 50s, and allow homeowners to subdivide them and sell off a lot to build a home, I think that would add housing supply. It would benefit the existing homeowners. We talked about that problem of increasing supply hurting existing homeowners. This would help them. This is a win-win for building supply in places that are in favorable commuting locations that would add additional housing stock.
I love that one. I haven't heard that one yet, but I really love that one.
We've seen it in operation in a lot of markets. It really helps, and you could even build virtual townhouses by doing that, real close to each other. That's a game changer in terms of the inner suburbs.
Especially if you didn't need like a special approval or a process to go through, it was just by right. That would be phenomenal.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of wave a magic wand. I can imagine the politics of that being complicated.
I love that one. I really, really love that one. All right, the last question is just for you. Give me a prediction. You could go 1 year out, 5 year out. Give me a prediction. You're on the record right here, and we can always look back and you can say, "Yeah, I said it. I put it out there. I was right on the money."
Yeah. Okay. So I'll do one, and I'll do one that's contrarian. So this is one where we're kind of thrown a flag far out there. I think we're probably about 7 or 8 years away from peak national builder market share. One of the trends over the last 25 to 30 years has been gaining market share for the biggest builders. I think we're going to see, given that decline in household formations, a rise in things like commercial redevelopment, a rise in tear down construction, which is about 8% of single family home building. Those are areas where typically the smaller builders typically do more of that activity. So the changing composition of building means that we're likely to see the big builder market share level off in the coming 5 or 6 years. It's a big sandbox. There's a lot of room for every player to play. They all have their unique strengths, but that would be a big moment in terms of some of the changing industry dynamics.
That's a whole podcast in itself right there.
That's right.
Yeah. And you said you had a second one too? Second prediction?
We talked about the other one, which is the townhouse construction is going to be about 25% of single family home building. I think that'll happen in the next 5 years.
All right. I love it. Dr. Dietz, thank you for being on the podcast. This was fantastic. If anybody wants to get a hold of you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, actually, just go to our economics blog, which is eyeonhousing.org. There's an email address on that page to send in questions. But I encourage builders, remodelers, bankers, realtors to read that economics blog. That's where the research of myself and my 12 team members is posted, and we talk about a lot of topics that we talked about today.
Oh, wow. Fantastic. Well, I hope to have you on again next year. We'll go ahead and host your information for them to get in touch with you at the NAHB. But again, thank you for being on the podcast. For our audience out there, we hope you follow and subscribe to this podcast. Comment on it if you want. But thank you all very much for jumping on and listening to us today. Thank you.
This podcast is intended for educational and informational purposes only and does not replace independent professional judgment. Land Gorilla Inc. makes no representations, warranties, or promises for and disclaims any express or implied warranties related to content. Before acting on any information, you should consider the appropriateness of the information as it pertains to your unique business needs.